It begins not with life, but with its end. In the summer of 1879, as the cicadas screamed in the trees of rural Alabama and the air hung heavy with the thick weight of dust and heat, a funeral was underway. Families in Clay County buried their dead as they had always done, quickly, reverently, in the bright gaze of day when neighbors could gather and scripture could be read aloud in the open light of God's sky. But this family was different. They would not allow the coffin to be lowered. Not yet. Not until the sun had begun its long descent beyond the horizon. Villagers who came to pay respects were left restless, shifting on their feet, glancing at the lowering sun. The coffin sat on its bier, the body within growing heavier with the hours. The preacher, accustomed to concluding burials in the full blaze of afternoon, hesitated, his Bible trembling slightly in his hands. "We must proceed," he urged softly, the sweat beading on his brow. But the family did not move. Their faces were stern, eyes fixed not on the minister, nor on the coffin, but on the slow march of the sun. Only when the last warmth of light stretched red across the horizon did they nod, allowing the coffin to be carried into the ground. What did it mean? Why would a family in God-fearing Alabama defy custom so blatantly? The questions began immediately. A burial is not only a ritual of closure, it is a public declaration, a binding of the dead to the soil and of the living to their grief. Yet here, that declaration was delayed, twisted, held captive by the waning day. To the onlookers, it was an act of strangeness, perhaps of arrogance. To the family, it was necessity. And so began one of the most unnerving customs whispered about in the rural South, a family who would bury their dead only at sunset. No exceptions. No explanations that satisfied anyone beyond their own circle. A ritual so strange it unsettled the community, leaving behind more unease than comfort. The cold open of this story rests in that image, the coffin waiting in the fading light, the silence of the family holding their neighbors in a grip of suspense. A simple act transformed into something haunting. The mystery is not violent, nor grotesque. It is subtle, which makes it all the more disturbing. Why did they fear the daylight? Why did they resist the ordinary rhythms of mourning? And why, in a town ruled by faith and tradition, did no one manage to break their practice? To understand the gravity of this ritual, one must imagine what death meant in the 19th century American South. Disease was common, life expectancy short, and the presence of death was intimate and constant. Funerals were communal events, neighbors digging graves with their own hands, families sewing burial clothes by lamplight. Customs were deeply respected because they provided a fragile sense of order in a world that often seemed chaotic and cruel. To step outside those customs was to invite suspicion, and perhaps condemnation. And yet, in 1879, this family invited both willingly. The first time it was witnessed, whispers spread like wildfire across Clay County. Some said it was merely eccentricity, a quirk of one grieving father or mother. But when it repeated itself again, when the pattern became undeniable, it grew into something larger. People began to murmur about curses. About old-world superstitions. About omens tied to the fading light of day. Some suggested the family had carried beliefs from an older land, Celtic, perhaps, or pagan in nature, that clashed with their Christian neighbors. Others feared it meant something worse, that the family knew of things the rest of the community did not. The hook of the mystery is this tension between explanation and silence. The family never shouted, never threatened, never explained with fire and brimstone. Their refusal was quiet. Calm. Immovable. They simply said the burial could not occur until the sun touched the horizon. And when the orange glow stretched across the Alabama sky, when the fields of clay soil burned crimson in the fading light, they allowed the earth to receive the dead. This silence, this lack of justification, terrified their neighbors more than any wild proclamation could. A scream of madness can be dismissed. A calm, unbreakable tradition without reason sinks into the bones of a community like a chill that cannot be shaken. It suggests knowledge that outsiders cannot grasp, secrets kept behind walls of bloodline and family lore. The cinematic power of this opening lies in its stillness. A coffin at rest, time ticking toward sunset, the murmurs of a gathered crowd, the quiet determination of a family locked into ritual. It is the stillness before a storm, not of weather, but of curiosity, fear, and legend. This section establishes the questions that will guide the entire narrative. Why sunset? Was it religious? Was it superstitious? Was it the remnant of some half-forgotten terror? And perhaps most chilling of all, did it protect the living from the dead? As the funeral ended and the family walked home under a darkening sky, the neighbors dispersed, whispering into the night air. Some claimed they had seen strange expressions on the mourners' faces, not grief alone but relief, as though they had evaded something by waiting for the sun to fall. Others insisted it was nothing but stubbornness. Yet all agreed on one thing: something was not right. And as the days stretched on, that unease never left them. The burial at sunset was not an isolated occurrence. It was a pattern. And every pattern hides a story. This first chapter leaves the audience suspended in that twilight moment, the air thick with unanswered questions, and a family bound by a rule no outsider could break. From here, the tale begins to unravel, not quickly, not loudly, but with the slow burn of a candle guttering in the dusk. To understand why this strange ritual of sunset burials unsettled an entire community, one must first step back into the world of Clay County, Alabama, in the year 1879. It was a place where land was both life and burden, where families clung to their farms with calloused hands, and where religion was not simply faith but the rhythm by which days and nights were ordered. The war between North and South had ended more than a decade earlier, yet its shadow lingered like smoke that refused to drift away. The Reconstruction era had left scars, political, social, and spiritual. Men carried wounds that did not heal, women shouldered the work of entire households, and children grew up knowing hardship as their first language. In this world, death was no stranger. It came in fevers that swept through homes, in farm accidents, in childbirth, and in the lingering consequences of war. To live in Clay County meant living always in sight of the grave. The town itself was small, no more than a cluster of homes, a church with whitewashed wood that blistered in the summer sun, a general store stocked with the bare necessities, and a scattering of farmhouses separated by acres of red clay soil. Life was simple, but it was never easy. Every family knew the weight of labor and the fragility of survival. Yet amid the toil, they shared rituals that gave them comfort: Sunday sermons, community barn raisings, harvest gatherings, and, most solemn of all, funerals. Burials in Alabama were communal acts. When death visited, neighbors would gather with shovels, digging the grave by hand while hymns were hummed under the breath. Women prepared food for the mourning household, while children ran errands in hushed silence. The act of burying was not only about laying a body to rest but about binding the community together. The grave was lowered in the daylight, the words of the preacher carrying across the fields, so that all could see the closure and believe that order had been restored. Within this tightly woven fabric of faith and routine lived the family at the center of our story. They did not live in the town itself but on the outskirts, where the trees thickened and the land grew quieter. Their farm was not remarkable: fields of corn and cotton, livestock penned in wooden fences, a modest house that leaned slightly against the wind. Yet neighbors spoke of them as different, though rarely with cruelty. They were private, solemn, their children polite but quiet, their appearances at gatherings rare. They worked hard, they paid their debts, but they seemed bound by some gravity others did not feel. The isolation of the farm mirrored the isolation of their lives. In a place where church bells called families each Sunday without fail, their attendance was irregular. When they came, they sat apart, speaking to no one more than courtesy required. Some said they were proud. Others whispered they were secretive. But all agreed that something about them resisted the patterns of ordinary life. In 1879, Alabama was a land caught between belief and doubt. The church taught eternal truths, yet the century was also a time of unsettling discoveries: medicine advancing, science questioning old certainties, newspapers carrying tales of inventions and philosophies that unsettled the faithful. Yet in rural Clay County, the Bible still reigned, and to defy its customs was to draw suspicion. A burial at sunset, defying the long-held practice of daylight funerals, was more than unusual. It was dangerous. Superstition ran alongside faith like a shadow. People spoke of signs in the sky, of omens in the cries of animals, of the dead who lingered when not properly laid to rest. Even the most devout churchgoer might still place a piece of iron above a doorway or avoid whistling after dark. In such a world, a family who buried their dead only at sunset stirred not only curiosity but primal fear. And so, the soil of Clay County was fertile ground for the legend that would grow. Every farmhand who glanced toward that family's land, every mother who hushed her child at the mention of them, contributed to the aura that surrounded them. They were ordinary farmers, and yet not ordinary at all. Their farm carried whispers the way the clay carried heat long after the sun had set. This section, then, is not about a single moment but about an atmosphere. It is about a town held together by routine, wary of the unusual. It is about a time when death was familiar but had to be managed properly, when rituals were not suggestions but necessities. It is about how quickly suspicion could bloom in a community where faith was strong but fear was never far behind. By the end of this chapter, the viewer knows the world in which the mystery unfolded. A land of heat and hardship, bound by belief, unsettled by difference. A family set apart not by wealth, not by crime, but by silence and ritual. And it is within this world, heavy with history and superstition, that the strange practice of burying only at sunset took root. It was the summer heat that made people remember it so vividly. Alabama in July does not forgive. The air grows thick, the insects rise in endless clouds, and the smell of decay travels quickly. That was why the townsfolk were disturbed when the family refused to bury their daughter until the sun began to fall. A child had died, a girl of no more than 10, thin and pale, taken by fever in the night. By morning, word spread through the county. Neighbors gathered as they always did, not only to console but to ensure the rites of death were observed. They came expecting the familiar rhythm of mourning. A preacher reading psalms. Women with baskets of food. Men with shovels waiting to fill the earth. Yet when they arrived at the family's farm, something was amiss. The coffin was there, built hastily from pine and lined with white cloth, but no grave had been filled. The family stood nearby, stern and watchful, refusing to move the child's body into the ground. The preacher tried to guide them. His voice was steady, though strained, as he spoke of Scripture and the peace of returning dust to dust. But the family shook their heads. Not yet, the father said, his voice quiet but absolute. The sun has not set. Hours passed. The mourners shifted under the oppressive sky, fanning themselves with handkerchiefs, whispering about the smell that would surely come. Death in the south demanded haste, the heat would not permit otherwise. Yet the family remained unmoved. They kept the coffin covered with a thin sheet, waiting, while the sun beat down. By late afternoon, tempers had begun to fray. Some whispered that it was madness. Others muttered that it was sin, that the soul of the girl might wander if denied its proper rest. But the family stood together in grim silence. And then, at last, when the sun began to dip low and the sky shifted to amber, they gave a single nod. The coffin was carried to the grave. The earth opened. The ritual was complete. That day marked the beginning of whispers that would never fade. People could not forget what they had seen. A child's funeral should have been a solemn moment of grief shared openly, but instead it became an unsettling performance that unsettled the entire community. Why had they waited? What compelled them to hold back a burial when every hour of delay risked desecrating the dignity of the child? Some neighbors were quick to condemn. It is against the order of God, one farmer said later. The Lord commands nothing about the setting of the sun. They act as if they know better than His word. Others tried to excuse it as grief. Perhaps the father could not let go. Perhaps the mother clung to the fading hours as if they were keeping her child close a little longer. But even those sympathetic could not explain why this pattern repeated itself again and again. For it was not the only time. Months later, another death came, a grandmother this time, a woman frail with age. Once more, the family refused a daytime burial. Again, they held the body through the long, hot afternoon, waiting for the sky to dim. The coffin lowered only when the first shadows of evening stretched long across the ground. By then, people were no longer shocked but deeply uneasy. A choice might be forgiven once. Twice meant tradition. The memory of the girl's funeral, however, clung most strongly. Children whispered of it at night, imagining the girl restless in her coffin, her spirit hovering until the sun went down. Adults, though they did not speak so freely, wondered the same. Was the family afraid that if buried too soon, the dead might not stay in their graves? It was in these whispers that the family's reputation began to shift from odd to ominous. Neighbors still waved when passing their farm, but with a hesitance, as though acknowledging people they no longer quite understood. At church, some avoided their pew altogether. Others pressed them with questions that received only silence in return. The family offered no explanation, no sermon, no superstition voiced aloud. Only action. And action is sometimes more frightening than words. In the South of the 19th century, where religion shaped every aspect of life, unexplained rituals stirred deep unease. It was one thing to lose a child, another to seem to challenge God in the burial of that child. Some muttered about curses, saying perhaps the land itself was tainted. Others leaned on folklore, suggesting that the family had knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge no one dared voice. Still others whispered of fear, the fear of something seen long ago, something that had convinced them that burial under the daylight sky carried danger too great to risk. What remained most haunting to those who witnessed that first burial was the family's demeanor. They were not frantic. They were not hysterical. Their grief was real, but their discipline was stronger. Their patience was not human patience, it was ritual patience. They waited as though waiting was a duty older than their own lives. And so the girl, nameless in most accounts, became the beginning of a legend. Her burial at sunset was the spark that ignited years of speculation, fear, and silence. Her death was not only a family's tragedy but the moment a community began to fracture into curiosity and suspicion. In the quiet of that evening, when the last hymn was sung and the last handful of soil thrown onto her coffin, neighbors walked home unsettled. They carried with them not only the sorrow of a young life lost, but the unease of something unexplained. And unease, once planted, grows quickly. That funeral became the story told over fences, whispered in kitchens, and debated in the back pews of the church. It was the death that drew attention, the first moment when the ordinary rhythm of life in Clay County faltered and the strangeness of one family cast its shadow across them all. Clay County was not a place where secrets stayed quiet for long. Farms were spread wide, but the community was tightly bound, every family knowing the business of the next. A cow wandering off, a field failing to yield, a child falling ill, such things were spoken of from porch to porch until all had heard. And so, after the little girl's burial at sunset, whispers grew like vines that could not be trimmed. What had been unsettling to those who stood at the funeral became rumor to those who had not, and rumor always carries more weight than truth. At first, the stories were simple. They would not bury her until the sun was down, people told one another, shaking their heads. But in the retelling, details crept in like shadows. One woman claimed the coffin had shaken, though she admitted she had not seen it herself. A man insisted the family had lit candles and muttered strange words as the sun fell. Another swore that the father's eyes had gleamed in the dusk, as though he knew something unholy was near. Each telling grew darker, because fear always colors memory. The neighbors closest to the family carried the greatest burden of unease. They passed the farm often, watching the children who seemed quiet beyond their years, watching the parents whose faces rarely softened. The farm was orderly, its fences straight, its crops healthy. And yet there was a sense of weight about it, as though the soil itself carried secrets. Men plowing nearby fields spoke in hushed tones, never lingering too long by the borders. Women warned their children not to wander there. The church, usually a place where order was restored, did not still the whispers. On the contrary, the absence of answers fanned them. The preacher, pressed by concerned members of the congregation, tried to downplay what had happened. He called it grief, nothing more. "We must not judge a family for how they mourn," he said. But his words did not convince. Too many had seen the same pattern, too many had felt the same chill. The silence of the family spoke louder than any sermon. As months passed, the whispers grew bolder. Some said the family feared the dead waking, if buried too soon, a fear not unknown in those days. Tales of premature burial haunted the century, stories of claw marks inside coffins, of bells tied to corpses, of graves reopened to reveal terror frozen in a final expression. Perhaps the family had once seen such a thing. Perhaps their ritual was not superstition, but precaution. Others took the whispers further. They spoke of curses, of old-world beliefs carried from across the sea. "They are not like us," one neighbor muttered, though no one could say why. The South was full of stories of witches, of haunted bloodlines, of families bound to strange traditions. To some, the sunset burials were proof that this family was touched by something older, darker, and unspoken. Children, as they always do, carried the stories into their play. They dared one another to run up to the family's fence at dusk, to shout and flee before the shadows grew. They invented games about coffins that opened at night, about spirits that lingered until the sun was gone. What was a ritual of grief to the family became a game of fear to the children of Clay County. Even practical men could not entirely dismiss the unease. Farmers, hardened by labor, admitted quietly that they felt a shiver when passing the farm after dark. "There's something in the air there," one said. "Like the land itself is watching you." The words were said half in jest, but no one laughed too loudly. As the family continued their practice, burying at sunset each time death visited, the whispers hardened into certainty. It was no longer rumor but accepted truth: they would not put their dead in the ground before evening. The community waited with grim curiosity each time, wondering if the pattern would break, hoping for proof that it was nothing more than grief. But it never broke. In this way, the family became both isolated and infamous. They did not defend themselves. They did not explain. They carried on as though the whispers were nothing, as though their ritual was simply the way of things. But their silence only deepened the mystery. For silence is fertile soil for fear. By the end of that year, Clay County was divided between those who condemned them as sinners and those who pitied them as haunted. Some avoided them entirely, crossing the road rather than pass too close. Others offered sympathy but in quiet tones, afraid to be seen too close. The family lived as if untouched by either response, their lives outwardly normal, their farms still tended, their days still ordered by the sun. Yet every time death struck, the ritual returned, and every time, the whispers grew. It is here that the story begins to shift from a strange curiosity into something more powerful. For in the telling and retelling, in the whispers by firelight and in the hushed voices of churchgoers, the family's practice was no longer just their own. It had become part of the community's identity, a shadow over Clay County itself. By this stage, the family had not committed crime, nor violence, nor open rebellion. They had simply buried their dead at sunset. Yet in a world ruled by order, ritual, and faith, that alone was enough to make them outcasts. And so the whispers endured, like an echo in the fields, like the cicadas that never ceased their cry in the Alabama heat. What began as a single funeral had become a legend in the making. A legend that grew stronger with every word spoken, every suspicion passed from neighbor to neighbor, every shiver felt as the sun dipped below the horizon and the fields of red clay darkened into night. The whispers that spread across Clay County could not remain whispers forever. In a community where the church was the heart of life, where sermons dictated not only belief but behavior, strange customs eventually demanded confrontation. And so, after the second and third sunset burials, when unease had hardened into suspicion, the preachers and elders of the county resolved to speak directly to the family. It was a Sunday morning when the matter was first pressed. The family had come to service, as they did sometimes, sitting in their usual place near the back. Their presence always drew glances, but this time the glances were sharper. The preacher's sermon began as it always did, with verses about the brevity of life, the certainty of death, and the promise of salvation. But midway through, his words shifted. His voice grew firmer. God commands us to honor the dead, he declared, his eyes sweeping across the pews. Not with delay, not with defiance of his order, but with obedience. The soul departs at the moment of death. The body is but clay. To hold it back is to doubt the Lord's design. Everyone knew at whom those words were aimed. Heads turned toward the family at the back. The father sat rigid, the mother's face unreadable. The children stared forward, their hands folded tightly. They gave no sign of shame, no gesture of rebellion. They were simply still, as though the words washed over them without effect. After the service, some hoped the family might relent. They did not. The next funeral proved it. Once again the coffin remained untouched through the long afternoon, neighbors pacing in discomfort, the preacher's face dark with frustration. Only when the sun began to sink did the family allow the burial to proceed. This defiance stirred not anger alone but fear. If the church's words could not sway them, then what power guided them? To resist Scripture in the South of the 19th century was to step into dangerous ground, for faith was not only belief but law, identity, and order. The family's silence in the face of sermons became a louder act than any shouted rebellion. Neighbors began to confront them more directly. One elder rode out to their farm, Bible in hand, and demanded an explanation. "You endanger your souls," he warned, "and the souls of your kin." The father's reply was calm, his voice low, "The danger is not in waiting. The danger is in rushing. Nothing more. No elaboration, no apology. Just that cryptic phrase." The elder left unsettled, unable to press further. The words carried weight. The danger is in rushing. What danger? What did they fear in the daylight that vanished at dusk? The answer was never given, and the refusal to explain became more frightening than any superstition people could invent. A curse can be named. A spell can be broken. But silence is a wall too high to climb. Some members of the church pushed harder, calling for discipline. They spoke of excommunication, of driving the family from the congregation altogether. But others hesitated. The family was not violent. They caused no harm beyond their strange ritual. And though their defiance unsettled, it was quiet defiance, steady and immovable, like stone. In the end, the church chose silence, perhaps out of fear of stirring something it could not contain. The family's persistence created a strange balance in the county. Publicly, they were condemned. Privately, they were left alone. People shook their heads in disapproval, but few dared confront them face to face. It was as though the community instinctively recognized that whatever bound the family to this ritual was stronger than any sermon or decree. For the family, each burial deepened their separation. They stood apart not because they wished to be proud but because they could not do otherwise. Their ritual had become the line they could not cross, the truth they would not abandon. It was their inheritance, their law, older than the town, older perhaps than the church itself. This section of the story shows not only the family's stubbornness but the profound tension between faith and defiance, between the rigid order of Scripture and the mysterious weight of tradition. In a world where almost nothing could be openly questioned, this family did not argue, they simply resisted. And their resistance had an unexpected effect. It did not merely set them apart. It unsettled the faith of those around them. For if this family was wrong, why did they not break? Why did they carry on with such calm certainty? And if they were right, what danger had the rest of the county been blind to all along? By the end of this chapter, the family is no longer simply strange. They are something more troubling. They are unyielding. Their silence in the face of religious condemnation becomes a mystery deeper than the ritual itself. Faith demanded obedience, but they chose defiance, and that choice would only make their legend darker in the years to come. By the time several burials had followed the same pattern, the people of Clay County could no longer dismiss the ritual as a fleeting quirk of grief. It was a law within the family, as unshakable as sunrise itself. And when silence met every inquiry, the community did what humans have always done in the absence of answers: they filled the void with theories. The simplest explanation whispered among neighbors was fear of premature burial. It was not an unfamiliar terror in the 19th century. Newspapers across America ran accounts of people declared dead who later awoke in their coffins. Medical journals published debates on how to confirm death with certainty. Some families tied strings to the hands of the deceased, attaching them to bells above ground so that if movement came, a faint ringing would warn the living. Perhaps, people said, this family had once witnessed such a horror. Perhaps they waited for the sun to fall not out of superstition, but to give the dead one final chance to stir before being sealed beneath the clay. Others scoffed at this. If fear of premature burial was the cause, why not wait until morning light? Why not bury at dawn, when the world was fresh and the air cool? Sunset seemed too precise, too symbolic, to be born of mere practicality. No, they said, this was something older. Some turned to heritage. The South was a patchwork of ancestry: Scots-Irish, English, German, African, Native American, and with ancestry came old beliefs, carried quietly across oceans and generations. Certain European folk customs spoke of twilight as the hour when the veil between worlds thinned. Perhaps this family's ancestors had clung to such rites, and through them, sunset became the only safe threshold for death. To the more superstitious, it was not just habit but protection. Burying at sunset sealed the grave when spirits walked, but before full darkness gave them power. There were also darker theories. A few townsfolk claimed the family had been cursed. The story changed depending on who told it: a wronged neighbor long ago, a preacher whose words were ignored, a woman accused of witchcraft in the colonial era. The curse, they said, demanded sunset burials, and to defy it would bring ruin on the family and the town alike. Such tales carried the delicious chill of folklore, though no proof was ever offered. Some spoke more quietly of the possibility of sightings. They must have seen something, one man insisted over whiskey at the general store. Something in the light of day, when a body was laid down before its time. They're not fools. They're not doing this for nothing. His words were met with uneasy silence, for no one wished to imagine what sight could bind a family so tightly to ritual. Traveling men, journalists and curious writers, sometimes heard the whispers and sought the truth. They recorded fragments of the story, publishing small accounts in regional papers. To them, the ritual was a curiosity to be explained, a human oddity to fill a column. Some wrote that it was a holdover from African burial customs, brought by enslaved people and twisted by local superstition. Others claimed it was linked to native practices that honored dusk as sacred. None of these theories were verified, but each added another layer to the mystery, another way for outsiders to marvel at what locals had begun to dread. There was even a scientific voice among the speculators. A physician passing through remarked that in certain conditions, decomposition followed patterns more visible in daylight. He wondered if the family believed sunlight revealed corruption too vividly, that a body might seem less at peace under its harsh glare. Waiting for dusk softened the sight, cloaking the burial in mercy. It was a clinical explanation, yet it did little to ease the unease of those who had seen the waiting firsthand. What tied all these theories together was the absence of confirmation. The family never answered, never offered even the simplest reason. Their silence was an unbroken wall, and every theory was thrown against it like stones, none leaving a mark. This very refusal to explain gave the stories their strength. If the family had spoken, the mystery might have collapsed. But silence fed it, kept it alive, and gave it room to grow in the minds of neighbors and strangers alike. As the years passed, the speculations themselves became a kind of folklore. They were retold in kitchens and barns, growing with every retelling. Some favored the story of fear, others of curses, others of heritage. Each listener chose the version that most unsettled them, because the unsettling was the point. It gave shape to a fear that could not otherwise be named. And through it all, the family continued, unchanging. Graves dug at sunset. Coffins lowered only when the last edge of light kissed the horizon. Neighbors gathered in suspicion, children whispered, travelers asked questions, and still no explanation came. This section of the story, then, is not only about theories. It is about the human need to explain what cannot be explained, and how, in the absence of answers, imagination creates its own truth. In Clay County, the truth mattered less than the fear. And fear, once rooted in the soil, is almost impossible to uproot. By its end, the community was no longer asking whether the ritual was real, they had seen too many funerals to doubt. The question had shifted. It was no longer, do they bury at sunset? It was, why must they bury at sunset? And in the many possible answers, none comforting, the mystery deepened. By the late 1880s, the strange habit of sunset burials had moved from whispered gossip into the broader current of public concern. Clay County's church leaders could no longer ignore what had become, in their eyes, an affront to order. Death, they taught, belonged to the authority of God and His church, not to the private rituals of families who kept their own secret laws. Yet in the secluded hollow where this family lived, the minister's sermons seemed powerless, as though the sun itself sanctioned their defiance. At first, the church's response was soft, almost pleading. Ministers preached on the sanctity of burial traditions, reminding congregations that daylight was the symbol of Christ's triumph over death. Graves, they said, should be sanctified in the light of morning, when resurrection hope was strongest. Evening, by contrast, was associated with endings, with shadows, with the encroaching of darkness. To bury at sunset was to side with despair rather than salvation. These words were meant to shame, to pull the family back into accepted patterns, but they were met with the same unyielding silence that had frustrated neighbors for years. When persuasion failed, the tone hardened. From the pulpit, more pointed sermons condemned pagan ways and dark superstitions that had no place in Christian practice. Congregants were warned that tolerating such behavior invited God's judgment on the community as a whole. In whispers after service, people wondered if the strange illnesses and poor harvests of recent years were linked to the family's defiance. Public pressure grew, but the family did not bend. It was not only the church that felt threatened. Civic leaders worried as well. The late 19th century was a time of transition, when towns like Clay County tried to shake off their rural obscurity and align with the progress of the modern South. The presence of a family bound to a ritual that seemed half superstition, half folly, embarrassed the image of order they wanted to project. Local newspapers, echoing the church, printed stern editorials. We cannot permit in our midst a custom that reeks of the Dark Age, a practice that belongs to savages and not to civilized men. The family was never named, but everyone knew. The more they were condemned, the more isolated they became. People stopped trading with them in town, and children were warned not to walk near their property after dusk. At school, whispers about curses followed their surviving children, marking them with an invisible stain. Denial was no longer enough. Exclusion became the weapon. Yet the ritual endured. The religious leaders, still unsatisfied, pressed further. In 1891, one pastor sought to intervene directly. He attended the funeral of a distant cousin of the family, determined to oversee the rites himself. But as he waited through the long hours of the afternoon, the family gathered in quiet defiance, refusing to proceed until the sun dipped low. The pastor tried to insist. Voices rose, sharp and unyielding. Finally, the man stormed away in frustration, leaving the family alone to bury the body in their own manner. The town spoke of the confrontation for weeks. To some, it was proof of the family's stubbornness, to others, it was proof that even God's representatives could not touch them. Whispers of witchcraft gained traction then. It was not uncommon, in rural communities with little patience for unexplained behavior, to cloak defiance in the language of the occult. If they would not yield to church or town, then surely darker forces held them bound. The accusations were never formal, never brought before law or court, but they seeped into conversation, becoming a common way to explain what could not be explained. And yet, there was something more subtle at play. Beneath the anger and suspicion lay a deeper unease, one that the sermons and editorials could not erase. For even as ministers thundered against the practice, even as neighbors denounced it, there remained the gnawing possibility that the family knew something the rest did not. What if the ritual was not merely rebellion, but protection? What if defying it truly would bring danger, not just to them, but to everyone? This unspoken fear kept the loudest critics from ever intervening too forcefully. Their condemnation thundered in words, but in deeds, they stopped short. The contradiction was never admitted aloud. Publicly, the burials were ridiculed as nonsense, a shameful blot on the community. Privately, many stayed clear of the family's land, avoiding the hollow at sunset as though the shadows there were different from shadows elsewhere. The denial itself became its own ritual, an effort to speak against what one secretly feared might be real. The church, sensing its waning influence, doubled down in the following years. Religious tracts circulated, condemning midnight rites and warning of the dangers of superstition. Families were encouraged to uphold traditional burials as a sign of faith. Yet these efforts only highlighted how deeply the family's silence had unsettled the community. For no matter how many words were written or spoken, they could not erase the image of a coffin being lowered as the last light slipped behind the hills. In time, the matter ceased to be debated openly. By the mid-1890s, the clergy no longer made the practice a central issue in their sermons. Perhaps they realized that every condemnation only fueled curiosity. Perhaps they were weary of a struggle that yielded no change. Or perhaps, though they would not admit it, they too felt the unease of trying to wrestle with something that did not belong to them. And so public denial hardened into silence. The family was left to its ritual, cut off from the wider community, but unbroken. The town carried on, presenting itself as orderly, Christian, respectable. Yet beneath the surface lingered the suppressed knowledge that not everything within its borders was under control. That in a quiet hollow, as the sun fell, something took place that neither sermon nor law could touch. This section, then, marks a turning point in the story. The mystery of the sunset burials was no longer only a private matter, it had become a public scandal, resisted with words, cloaked in denial, smothered in religious rhetoric. And yet, through all the fire and fury, nothing changed. The family held to its silence. The ritual endured. And the questions, like the graves themselves, remained open. By the mid-1890s, the strange ritual of sunset burials had hardened into something more than a curiosity. For the family, it was no longer just tradition, it had become survival. For the town, it was no longer just defiance, it had become a shadow pressing at the edges of their daily lives. And when shadows press long enough, they begin to seep into thought, into dreams, into the fragile places where fear takes root. The escalation began quietly. A neighbor's daughter claimed to have seen candlelight flickering among the headstones in the hollow after dusk, long after the family had left. Another spoke of hearing low, muffled voices carried on the wind, though no one was present. At first these stories were brushed off as imagination, the sort of tales children spin in lonely places. But repetition has its own power. Each new retelling added weight, until even those who had scoffed began to avoid the hollow road when the light faded. In the family itself, change was evident too. Their eyes seemed more guarded, their movements slower, more deliberate. To some, it appeared as though every member of the household lived with an unspoken burden. The children in particular carried the weight. Accounts survive of them sitting in schoolrooms, staring blankly out the windows as lessons went unheard. Teachers noted their restlessness in the afternoons, a strange anxiety that grew as the day stretched toward dusk. It was as if each setting sun marked a point of tension, a moment they could not ignore. Psychological decay did not stop at the family's doorstep. The townspeople themselves were not immune. For though they denounced the ritual in public, many lay awake at night, unsettled by what it might mean. Why would anyone tie themselves to a ritual so rigid, so costly in reputation and belonging, unless they had reason? And if they had reason, what truth did the rest of the town refuse to face? These questions spread silently, eroding certainty. Soon, even natural deaths in Clay County began to feel different. When a man passed away at noon, his family gathered quickly, hurrying the burial before the sun could fall. Best not tempt fate, they whispered. Some began to wait until evening services to mourn, though they did not bury at dusk. It was a strange half-measure, as if fear and faith wrestled quietly in the same ritual space. The family's sunset burials were not adopted outright, but they warped the behavior of others all the same. Rumors thickened. Some claimed that bodies not buried at sunset decayed faster, or that strange sounds came from graves left open overnight. There were whispers of animals refusing to cross the burial ground, of dogs howling at the precise moment the sun vanished. The more the family persisted, the more the community convinced itself that some invisible thread connected life, death, and the angle of the sun. Psychologists today might call this contagion of belief. A community, when faced with something inexplicable, bends its collective mind toward explanations, any explanations, that can bear the weight of unease. But in 19th-century Alabama, such language did not exist. There was only fear, suspicion, and the slow unraveling of peace of mind. For the family, the isolation deepened. Trips to town became rare. Their names slipped from guest lists and invitation cards. Children's laughter quieted when they passed by. And yet, even cut off from the comfort of neighbors, they endured. To abandon the ritual was impossible. To hold it was costly. They chose the cost. The psychological strain left marks, though. Oral histories describe the family as gaunt, pale, almost spectral in later years. Some neighbors claimed they never saw them smile. Others said their voices had grown hollow, that they spoke less and less, as though saving their strength for something unseen. Whether these impressions were true or products of fearful imagination, the effect was the same. The family became a living symbol of tension, the proof that something unspeakable lurked behind the ritual. Meanwhile, younger townsfolk began to rebel against the silence of their elders. A group of boys, emboldened by bravado, crept to the burial ground one evening, hiding among the trees as the coffin was lowered. What they expected, none could say. What they saw, according to later retellings, was ordinary, too ordinary. And yet, when they emerged, pale and shaken, they swore never to return. They would not even describe what unsettled them, only muttering that it was wrong and refusing to answer further questions. Their silence spoke louder than any tale. The tension even touched those who outwardly denied it. Farmers who once mocked the family began finishing their fieldwork before sunset, muttering excuses about supper waiting at home. Women hung charms over doorways at dusk, just in case. Preachers, though careful with their words, hesitated in graveyards after dark. The ritual had infected the rhythm of the community itself. And in that infection lay its truest power. The family did not need to explain themselves. They did not need to argue, or defend, or persuade. By holding their silence and repeating the ritual year after year, they allowed the minds of others to do the work for them. Imagination filled the gaps. Fear filled the silence. And each repetition of the burial stitched the dread deeper into collective memory. But dread has consequences. By the turn of the century, whispers of mental strain appeared. Some townsfolk reported vivid dreams, coffins being lowered into glowing pits, the sun freezing in the sky, shadows crawling across the walls of their rooms. Others spoke of waking in the night with a sense of suffocation, as though dirt were being heaped upon them. Doctors called it night terrors, but patients linked it to the burials. Always the burials. The escalation, then, was not of violence or spectacle, but of mind. The ritual seeped into thought until it governed the pace of daily life, shaping fears, shaping behaviors, shaping dreams. It was not simply that a family buried their dead at sunset. It was that everyone else, whether they admitted it or not, began to live in the long shadow of that choice. The result was a town caught between ridicule and reverence. On the surface, people scoffed, dismissing the family as strange, misguided, perhaps even cursed. Beneath the surface, they altered their lives in quiet ways to avoid colliding with the ritual. This duality, mockery above, fear below, was itself a form of psychological decay. It eroded trust in community, in tradition, in shared reality. And so the mystery grew, not with sudden revelations, but with slow corrosion. Every sunset became heavier. Every funeral became a question. Every whispered rumor became another thread in the tapestry of dread. By refusing to break their ritual, the family had forced the town to share in it. In this way, the escalation was complete. The ritual no longer belonged only to the family. It belonged to the community that feared it, to the children who dreamed of it, to the farmers who hurried at dusk, to the ministers who thundered in denial. It belonged to the very air of Clay County, heavy and unsettled, charged with meaning no one dared speak aloud. By the late 1890s, the ritual of sunset burials had reached beyond the quiet confines of the family itself and lodged firmly in the life of Clay County. It was no longer a matter of private grief or household tradition. It had become a public rift, a line drawn between those who dismissed the ritual as folly and those who, in their secret hearts, feared that perhaps it was wiser than it seemed. Communities fracture slowly, but once fractures appear, they deepen with every season. At first, the reactions were small, little gestures of disapproval. Neighbors began to look away when the family passed through town. Merchants spoke curtly, handing over goods without pleasantries. Women whispered in church pews, glancing at the family with suspicion. These were the earliest signs of division, almost invisible if taken alone, but unmistakable when woven together. Over time, the whispers grew into open hostility. Children bore the brunt of it. In schoolyards, classmates teased them with cruel chants. Gravekeepers, some called them. Others accused them of carrying curses, warning that to play with them was to invite misfortune. Teachers, though reluctant to intervene, could not ignore the way the classroom itself split. The family's children sat alone, eyes lowered, while the others huddled together, bound by shared mockery and fear. Such divisions scar young minds, and the children carried those scars into adulthood. The pulpit soon became a battlefield. Preachers thundered against heathen practices and dark customs that insult the Almighty. They did not always mention the family by name, but everyone knew who was meant. Some congregations demanded that the family renounce their ritual or be barred from the sanctuary. When the family refused, attendance at those churches became another measure of loyalty. To sit beside the family was to risk one's reputation, to shun them was to show one's righteousness. Yet for every voice raised against them, there were quiet ones that trembled with doubt. Some townsfolk, particularly the elderly, recalled fragments of their own family lore, old superstitions about death and time, about the need to honor the setting sun. A few even whispered that their grandparents had once spoken of similar customs, long since abandoned. These half-memories lent a strange credibility to the ritual. If such beliefs had existed before, perhaps there was reason they had endured in this one stubborn household. The town began to divide along these invisible lines. On one side were the skeptics, farmers, businessmen, preachers who saw the ritual as an embarrassment, a blot on the county's reputation. On the other side were the cautious believers, too fearful to say it aloud, but unwilling to condemn the family outright. Most lived somewhere in the middle, scoffing in daylight but clutching charms at night. What united them all, however, was unease. Whether they hated or feared, no one was free from the ritual's grip. The division even affected commerce. Some shops refused to sell to the family, citing moral objections. Others continued to trade with them but quietly marked their coins, returning them to circulation only with reluctance. Farmers avoided lending equipment, fearing that tools used by the family would carry some unseen stain. Yet in darker moments, these same men admitted, never publicly, that they sometimes watched the sunset burials from a distance, unable to look away. In gatherings and festivals, the family's absence became an unspoken presence. At harvest dances, mothers forbade their daughters from standing too close to the family's boys. At county fairs, whispers rose if one of them wandered near a game booth. The effect was paradoxical: the more the community tried to cast the family out, the more they remained at the center of every whispered conversation. The ritual had made them both outcasts and unavoidable. The press, too, caught scent of the division. Local newspapers hinted at strange goings-on in Clay County, though never with enough detail to confirm the truth. Such coverage only deepened the divide. Some residents fumed at being portrayed as backward. Others bristled with pride, insisting the ritual was proof of deeper knowledge outsiders could never understand. In both cases, the ritual became a symbol, not just of burial, but of identity itself. And with identity came conflict. Meetings were called in town halls, with heated arguments about whether the family should be forced to stop. "It makes us a laughingstock," shouted one man. "It brings a curse on us all," cried another. Yet for every demand to intervene, there was hesitation. What right, after all, did the town have to dictate how a family buried its dead? And if there was truth to the ritual, if it truly warded off some unseen danger, would stopping it not risk worse? Fear, once more, silenced resolve. The longer the division lingered, the sharper it grew. Marriages were broken off when one family was accused of being too sympathetic. Friendships cooled when one neighbor was seen speaking kindly to the family. Even church attendance shifted, congregants choosing pastors who reflected their stance on the burial controversy. A ritual that began in a hollow graveyard now echoed through the fabric of social life, pulling it apart thread by thread. At the core of this division lay a painful irony. The family themselves never asked for converts, never demanded that anyone follow their example. They kept their ritual private, silent, unyielding. It was the community that gave it voice, argument, and fury. By their very resistance, the townsfolk gave the ritual more power than the family alone ever could have. There were, however, moments of quiet compassion. A few brave souls, moved by pity, brought food to the family when crops failed. Others offered to walk their children home when threats grew too sharp. These acts of kindness, whispered and hidden, reveal that even in the darkest divisions, humanity flickers. Yet those who showed kindness risked being branded as sympathizers, and so most remained silent, choosing safety over solidarity. By the dawn of the new century, Clay County was a place transformed. What had once been a town bound by shared labor and faith was now a fractured community, held together only by the weight of silence. Every gathering, every sermon, every burial was shadowed by the question of where one stood. Were you with the family, or against them? Did you mock, or did you fear? Neutrality was no longer possible. This was the true social cost of the ritual. It did not merely mark the family as different. It carved the town itself into factions, breeding resentment, suspicion, and mistrust. The ritual may have begun as a way of protecting the dead, but its most powerful effect was on the living, on their friendships, their loyalties, their very sense of community. By clinging to their sunset burials, the family had not only safeguarded their own. They had forced the entire county into confrontation with belief, fear, and belonging. In that confrontation, divisions hardened. And those divisions would not fade easily. By the time Clay County had split into factions, the ritual of sunset burials was no longer just a private act. It had seeped into the bloodstream of local storytelling. What began as whispers in kitchens and muttered prayers on porches soon bloomed into something far larger. Rumors multiplied, and with them, folklore was born. In small towns, where the nights are long and silence is heavy, stories grow like weeds. The family's ritual became fertile soil, and out of it rose a tangle of legends, half warnings, half entertainments, that spread from house to house. At first, the stories were small and practical. Neighbors spoke of crops that failed after refusing to acknowledge the sunset burial. Others claimed a cow had gone dry when its owner mocked the family. A hunter swore he saw shadowed figures watching him from the trees on the very night of a burial. These accounts were often shrugged off in daylight, but retold with fervor around lamplight in the evenings. Every telling added a new detail: darker eyes in the woods, stranger voices in the fields, heavier silence in the graveyard. As the years stretched, the stories grew bolder. Some claimed the family's dead did not stay buried, that they walked the land at dusk, their faces hidden, their steps silent. Others insisted the ritual bound the dead to the soil itself, keeping them from wandering into homes at night. Still others whispered that the family had struck a bargain with something older than the church, a bargain that demanded obedience and secrecy. These were not spoken as theories but as warnings: don't laugh, don't stray too near, don't test what you cannot see. Folklore has a strange way of shaping itself to the teller's needs. For children, the ritual became a tool of discipline. Parents told them, if you don't behave, they'll bury you before sunset. For farmhands, it explained sudden accidents or misfortune. A man thrown from his horse was said to have mocked the burial weeks before. A fire in a barn was blamed on a spirit unsettled at dusk. In this way, the family's private ritual became the explanation for every unexplained event. Yet not all stories painted the family as cursed. Some gave them a dark kind of reverence. There were tales that the family could speak with the dead, that they carried knowledge others had lost. Old women whispered that the family's matriarchs knew herbs that could heal wounds faster than a doctor. A few claimed that to be buried at sunset by them was an honor, a guarantee of rest without disturbance. Fear and respect often share the same root, and in Clay County, the family occupied that uneasy space. Travelers passing through caught wind of the tales and carried them farther afield. By the early 1900s, nearby counties had their own versions of the legend. Some said the family had once been grave robbers who turned their crimes into ritual. Others claimed their land was cursed, soaked with blood from a massacre long forgotten. A few even suggested the family themselves were not fully human but keepers, sent to guard a boundary between the living and the dead. The farther from Clay County the story traveled, the stranger it grew, until the truth was buried beneath layers of invention. Within the town, folklore took on another shape: cautionary symbols. Lovers were told never to kiss in the graveyard at dusk. Farmers avoided whistling after dark, lest the spirits mistake it for a call. Children were warned that if they lingered too long outside during a burial, they would be seen and marked for death. These superstitions stitched themselves into daily life, quiet rules followed without question, even by those who claimed to disbelieve. One of the most persistent rumors centered on a particular burial said to have gone wrong. A man, so the story went, died suddenly in winter. The ground was hard, nearly frozen, and the grave too shallow. The family still carried him out at sunset, but as the last light slipped away, neighbors swore they heard a sound, knocking, faint but steady, from beneath the earth. The tale grew darker with each telling. Some said the man had been buried alive. Others claimed his spirit had never settled, that it still roamed the fields at dusk, searching for warmth. Even those who scoffed at the legend lowered their voices when they spoke of that burial. Folklore also gave the ritual a sense of inevitability. If something terrible happened, people said, it was bound to. The burials keep us balanced, but only barely. If something good happened, rain after drought, a healthy birth, others muttered, the family must have done one recently. In this way, every event in Clay County became a reflection of the ritual. Life itself bent toward it, as though the burials were the axis on which fate turned. The growth of legend was not without consequences. Strangers came to witness the burials, hiding at the edge of fields, hoping to glimpse something uncanny. Some brought notebooks, sketching and writing, treating the ritual as spectacle. Others came with darker intent, hurling insults or rocks from a distance, testing whether the family's supposed powers would strike them down. In both cases, the ritual was no longer protected by privacy. It had become theater, and the family unwilling actors. As decades passed, the stories took on a life of their own. New generations of children in Clay County grew up not knowing what was fact and what was legend. They only knew that the family was different, and that difference carried weight. Even those who laughed at the stories could not quite shake them, not when the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened across the fields. The ritual had transcended the family. It had become part of the land itself, rooted as firmly as the oak trees or the river. This is how folklore works: it binds people, not with proof, but with belief. In Clay County, belief was thicker than truth. The ritual, once just an act of burial, had become a symbol, a ghostly thread tying past to present, fear to reverence, suspicion to faith. Whether it was real or not no longer mattered. What mattered was that everyone believed enough to pass the stories on. And so, by the dawn of the 20th century, the family's ritual was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to the county, to the children who whispered it in the dark, to the preachers who thundered against it, to the farmers who cursed it and the wanderers who sought it out. It had grown beyond practice and into legend. In that transformation, the family lost control of their own story. The ritual was no longer what they did. It was what everyone else said it meant. By the time the folklore had taken firm root, the ritual was no longer just a matter of community whispers. It began to draw the attention of law enforcement, courts, and officials whose job was to uphold order in Clay County. What had once been seen as eccentric tradition started to look, through the eyes of outsiders, like possible crime. Burial practices carry weight in the law. Questions arose: were these burials legal? Were the graves marked? Was something being hidden beneath the ritual? The earliest involvement of law enforcement came quietly. A county deputy, acting on complaints from townspeople, rode out to observe a burial. He stayed hidden at a distance, his horse tied off in a grove of trees. The report he later filed was dry and factual. He noted the procession began before sundown, that the family carried the body without assistance, that prayers were spoken in tones too low to hear. He marked that the grave was dug by hand and filled before night fell. Nothing in his notes suggested illegality, yet his presence marked a shift. The ritual was no longer unseen. It was documented. Other officials soon followed. Clerks questioned why death certificates were sometimes filed late. A coroner wondered why he was never called to examine bodies. Ministers pressured county supervisors, claiming the ritual mocked Christian burial. Each raised the same underlying suspicion, that something was being concealed. For some, the secrecy itself was proof of wrongdoing. If it is innocent, one sheriff was quoted as saying, "Why do they hide it from the eyes of the county?" By the 1910s, scrutiny had sharpened into formal investigation. A sheriff's posse arrived at a family burial one evening, demanding the body be exhumed. Tensions flared. Relatives refused, forming a ring around the fresh grave. Witnesses recalled the moment vividly. Lanterns swayed, the sheriff's men with shovels in hand, the family standing silent, their faces lit with the last red of the sunset. No blows were struck, but the standoff was remembered for decades. It was the first time the law tried to pierce the ritual, and it failed. Yet failure did not quiet suspicion. Court records from surrounding counties began to list complaints: unmarked burials, failure to notify coroner, concealment of cause of death. In nearly every case, the complaints were dismissed for lack of evidence. But each filing left a trace, a paper trail of unease. Officials began to circulate stories of their own. Some said the family refused autopsies because they feared exposure of violence. Others whispered that not every body buried was dead before sunset. In the absence of proof, rumor bled into official record. Law enforcement's interest also fed the community's sense of fear. Each time a deputy arrived, people whispered that the family's power would strike him down. Each time a court dismissed a complaint, others claimed the judges were too afraid to challenge the ritual. Paradoxically, the more scrutiny officials applied, the more the legend deepened. Authority seemed powerless before the tradition, and powerlessness gave the ritual a darker, almost untouchable edge. In some instances, officials went further. A state investigator visited Clay County in the 1920s, dispatched after a newspaper in a neighboring county published a lurid article titled, "Buried Before the Last Light." The piece suggested the ritual was evidence of cult activity, perhaps even human sacrifice. The investigator interviewed townspeople, inspected graveyards, and reviewed church records. His final report was inconclusive, but his private notes, later discovered in archives, reveal his unease. "There is no evidence of crime," he wrote. "And yet, I cannot shake the impression that the practice serves some purpose beyond burial. The secrecy is deliberate, not incidental. The family protects more than tradition. They protect knowledge." The growing attention from law enforcement forced the family into defensive postures. They began digging graves deeper, ensuring no passerby could accuse them of shallow burials. They filed certificates more promptly, though always under protest. At times, they even allowed ministers to stand nearby, though never close enough to hear the prayers spoken over the dead. This balancing act, complying just enough to avoid legal action, resisting enough to protect secrecy, defined their relationship with authority for decades. Occasionally, tragedy deepened official suspicion. When a child disappeared from a neighboring farm in the 1930s, whispers immediately turned toward the family. Deputies questioned them, searched their property, even pried open fresh graves. Nothing was found. The child's body was discovered weeks later, drowned in a river miles away. Yet suspicion lingered. The image of deputies exhuming graves under the fading light stuck in the town's memory, proof that the ritual had become a matter of public record and confrontation. The 1940s and 1950s brought another layer of scrutiny: state health departments. With new regulations about sanitation and public cemeteries, officials demanded the family register their burial plots. Inspectors measured headstones, checked boundaries, and wrote citations. The family, unused to bureaucracy, bristled. Their graves were often unmarked or marked only with crude stones. Officials threatened fines. The family paid, but grudgingly, and with every exchange, resentment grew. What the community once tolerated as eccentricity now collided with the modern state's need for order. These official pressures gave rise to new legends. Some said a sheriff who tried to halt a burial died suddenly of fever. Others claimed a state inspector's car veered off the road after mocking the ritual. None of these stories were ever proven, yet they circulated with fervor, reinforcing the belief that authority could not challenge the family without consequence. Whether through fate or coincidence, officials who pried too deeply seemed to meet misfortune. In Clay County, coincidence was never just coincidence. By the 1960s, folklorists and journalists began arriving alongside deputies. What had once been private was now public spectacle, not just for neighbors but for anyone who read newspapers or journals. Articles mixed fact with myth, often exaggerating the family's defiance of law enforcement. A widely circulated piece described them as living beyond the reach of the sheriff's star, turning their story into symbol, the old against the modern, the secret against the exposed. The family's resistance to scrutiny became legend in itself. Through it all, law enforcement never found cause to prosecute. The burials, while unconventional, violated no statute outright. The family registered plots when pressed. They filed certificates when demanded. They allowed occasional witnesses, though never without tension. To the letter of the law, they complied just enough. Yet to the spirit of authority, they remained defiant. Officials came and went, but the ritual endured, unchanged in its essence. In the end, the scrutiny left marks not on the ritual but on the community's perception of it. Each time a sheriff rode out, children whispered. Each time an inspector arrived, townsfolk waited for calamity. The very presence of law enforcement became part of the legend, another thread woven into the fabric of fear and fascination. The family's relationship with authority was not defined by guilt or innocence but by stalemate, a contest of endurance in which the law never fully conquered tradition, and tradition never fully escaped the law. What remained was a paradox. The ritual was both illegal in spirit and unprosecutable in fact. It stood at the border of law's reach, protected not by violence or weapons but by the weight of belief, the persistence of secrecy, and the fear that to tamper with it would invite disaster. Law enforcement could glare, investigate, and threaten. But when the sun dipped low, and the family carried their dead across the fields, the law stood back. And the ritual continued.